Hey everybody, welcome to Sunday night. Hey, this evening, as far as announcements go, the best place to find and stay up to date with what's going on and when we're going to be meeting in person, hopefully, still shooting for the end of July, would be humc.org. Go to that website, see what's going on, get up to date with all the information on the feeding program and all the other things that are happening. Also, this week, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to give. Not waiting till the end this week. I'd love for you to give. You can give by going to our website, ournewstory.church, and there are 3 simple ways to give on there. You can either give online, you can give via text, or you can also mail in a check. But we would love for you to continue to worship God in that way as you continue to support the ministries of the church. Now, this week and next week are going to be a little bit different in terms of our worship service. This week, we have a special video of Pastor Chris sitting down and talking about racism, and so having a dialogue with another person. And so I would invite you to continue to stay and listen to that later on in this video. And then next week, the message is actually going to be given by our bishop, and so that's pretty cool. And so check out next week's video next Sunday, obviously. And I will be doing all the rest of the parts of the video, of course, but the bishop will be given the message that week. And so I hope you enjoy that. Maybe a little bit of a break from me. I don't know if you've had enough. But then I'll be back with another sermon series right after that to kind of take us through July and our time together. But hope everybody's well. Let us know if we can be in prayer with you about whatever's going on in your life, and stay up to date with each other. Thanks.
You've done before in greater measure, you will do again. 'Cause there's no prison wall you can't break through, no mountain you can't move. All things are possible. There's no broken body you can't raise, no soul that you can't save. All things are possible. The darkest night, you can light it up. You can light it up. Oh God of revival, let hope arise. Death is overcome. You've already won. God of revival, you rose in victory, and now you're seated forever on the throne. So why should my heart fear Lord, you've defeated. I will trust in you alone, 'cause there's no prison wall you can't break through, no mountain you can't move. All things are possible. There's no broken body you can't raise, no soul that you can't save. All things are possible. The darkest night, you can light it up. You can light it up. Oh, God of revival, let hope arise. Death is overcome. You've already won. Oh, God of revival. Whoa. Come awaken your people. Come awaken your city. Oh, God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. Every stronghold will crumble. I hear the chains hit the ground. Oh, God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. Come awaken your people. Come awaken your city. Oh, God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. Every stronghold will crumble. I hear the chains hit the ground. Oh, God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. The darkest night, you can light it up. You can light it up. Oh, God of revival, let hope arise. Death is overcome. You've already won. Oh, God of revival. Oh, yeah. Come awaken your people. Come awaken your city. Oh, God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. Every stronghold will crumble. I hear the chains hit the ground. Oh, God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. Come awaken your people. Come awaken your city. Oh, God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. Every stronghold will crumble. I hear the chains hit the ground. God of revival, pour it out, pour it out.
Let the king of my heart be the mountain where I run, the fountain I drink from. Oh, he is my song. Let the king of my heart be the shadow where I hide, the ransom for my life. Oh, he is my song. 'Cause you are good, good. Oh, you are good, good. Oh, you are good, you're good. Oh, you are good, good. Oh, let the king of my heart be the wind inside my sails, the anchor in the waves. Oh, he is my song. Let the king of my heart be the fire inside my veins, the echo of my days. Oh, he is my song. 'Cause you are good, you're good.
you're never gonna let me down. 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 'Cause you are good, you're good. Oh, you are good, you're good. Oh, yes, you are good, you're good. Oh, you are good, you're good. Oh, you're never gonna let me down. 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 'Cause you are good, you're good. Oh, you are good, you're good. Oh, you are good, you're good. Oh, you are good, you're good.
Welcome, my name is Chris Seifert, Senior Pastor here at Hermitage United Methodist Church. Today we have something a little different for us to talk about. 2020 has been the strangest year most of us have ever experienced. And just when we thought we were coming to grips with the epidemic of the COVID-19 virus, another epidemic has once again raised its ugly head. I can't call it a new thing because it's existed for most of history in some form or another. We call it racism. And you already know that over the last few weeks, our nation has once again witnessed and experienced the pain and struggle racism can cause. And let me start by acknowledging a few things right from the start today. I know this is a difficult subject. And I know there are some who don't want to really hear about this. I know there are some watching this right now who feel as though we shouldn't be addressing this in church. Other pastors and I have been told many times that we need to avoid political issues altogether, that we need to stay in our lane. But this is very much in our lane. While it may seem like just a political issue, it's also an issue of the heart. It's a moral issue. It's a justice issue. It's a God issue, which makes this a church issue. I've taught for years that God's justice is about taking what's wrong with the world and making it right. I acknowledge that it is a heated political topic, and we're as divided of a nation politically right now as maybe we've ever been. But racism has never been aligned with any one political party. It goes across the board. And some of us would be quick to respond that any type of racism is evil, whether against black people, against white people, or against immigrants. But there's a difference between racism and bias or prejudice. There can be bias among people of different races, just like I can be prejudiced or biased against the Dallas Cowboys. But racism is about people with power, usually white people like me, discriminating against people of color. It's hard to be racist against a white person because modern racism was born from the determined and systemic oppression of non-white people. Racism is about power. It's about violence and the echoes of slavery. And racism is a problem of the heart. It can't be resolved by laws. Racism cannot be cured with silence, and it cannot be cured with passive, peaceful listening. There's only one Christian response to racism, and that's becoming actively anti-racist. 1 Peter 3:10 through 12 said, "Whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil." Peter's challenge is to turn from evil and do good. We as a church must resist evil. We must seek peace and pursue it. We must seek peace. This means that we must believe our African American brothers and sisters about the systemic racism they face, even when we discover that we are part of the problem. We must advocate for real reform of unjust systems and real accountability for oppressive and violent acts. My hope for us all today is that we may take the first step for some of us in realizing the truth about who we are as a society, and the truth will set us free. So today I've invited the Reverend Roland Scruggs to join me. Roland is a much beloved member of our congregation and a retired United Methodist pastor. Would you welcome him here with me today? Roland, thanks for joining me here today to discuss this matter. You know, I grew up just across the lake, Old Hickory Lake in Hendersonville, and so for me, growing up was a different experience than you probably had growing up, obviously. And this discussion of racism was never a part of my growing up. It was never really held in our household. It was never a part of that. So I come into this admitting that I'm very weak in my knowledge on the subject of what's going on in our world in regards to racism and such. And so I appreciate you being here and willing to share your experiences with us today. So where are you from? Where did you grow up? Many of the people in our church know you, some others may not, but if you can give us some of your background story, where you grew up, what it was like.
Well, Chris, I was born in Chattanooga, Tennessee, February 1st, 1938. Actually, saying I was born in Chattanooga, Tennessee doesn't really paint the entire picture. I was born in North Chattanooga, Tennessee, which had some distinction between other parts of Chattanooga to some extent. Being across the river, originally that area I grew up was called Hill City, Tennessee. And a lot of people who lived there were close-knit families. It was kind of an isolated area to some extent, even in North Chattanooga, Tennessee, where we grew up. A lot of the places around there they called hollers because people were isolated into certain places. But it wasn't that distinct in terms of relationships, because 2 doors down from me was a white family. Across the street from them was another white family. On the other street, there were some white families. So they were some kind of intermingled right in that little section of North Chattanooga, Tennessee, where I grew up. A lot of things were going on in 1938, as you might remember, in history. But some of the concerns that we had during that time were not necessarily just race, because there were a lot of epidemics during the 30s, and especially during 1938, there was a tuberculosis hospital that was located within my community. A lot of the childhood type diseases were prevalent. Polio, there was a young man in my community who had polio. We had measles and mumps and whooping cough and that kind of thing that people were concerned about. Very close friend of mine came down. His family had suffered with tuberculosis. And my mother warned me that if I went to their house, not to eat, not to drink anything after any of the persons there.
Sure.
To be very careful. In fact, she even warned me, if I didn't have to, not even to go into the house. So this was more of a concern with some of the epidemics that were going on as much as race. Race was sometimes covert and overt. Of course, there were signs posted in the downtown areas in certain places in terms of race, mainly in the bus stations and places like that. And some of the others you kind of knew in terms of what practices were and what laws were there to some extent.
It was kind of an unwritten type rule.
Unwritten, but you knew those areas. If you passed the restaurants were primarily white. But there was that class system too in Chattanooga, and it was quite made aware to some extent. The people who controlled the economy were probably in the higher areas geographically. Lookout Mountain, Missionary Ridge, those were the richy areas where people lived, and where the common people lived were down in some of the other areas.
Downhill,
Yeah. And so those kind of things were going on with the concerns that people had. There were still people who were living almost like rural areas, even in the city, who had outside toilets. Some did. My family were one of the blessed ones. We didn't have. We were one of the few people who had a commode, but we had it in a room. We had to go out to the back porch and then go into a bathroom. We had just 3-room house. My dad worked in this tuberculosis. It was more than a hospital. It's kind of like I guess it was more like a family place to some extent. There were wards, and you went through the gate to get there, and there were different buildings that were scattered all through this area. But that facility was kind of going through a change even during the early part of the 40s. The other thing, of course, is World War I was about to break out. And after during that time, we would always...
World War II.
I meant, what did I say?
One, but
I meant World War II. World War II. The war had just broken out, and when I was about 3 years of age, we would, any metal items, canned goods, you broke those down and you brought them to school to support the war.
Right.
You could buy bonds, and we could buy for a dime, and had a little booklet and kept that. We had rationing books in order to purchase certain items at the store. We had to take those rationing books there.
Right.
So the war, and I say all of that to say there were other concerns.
It was just a tense environment all the way around
It
between
was a
epidemics
tense-
and wars. And,
You had war, you had disease, you had certainly race, and we didn't have the tension of race to the extent that some places had, especially in West Tennessee and Mississippi and places in Alabama that we would hear about. The NAACP had just organized in 1909. They were still addressing concerns because there was heavy lynching going on at the time the NAACP had been organized. You know that Separate but Equal had been 1896. That was still a carryover as to how it was being addressed and how the NAACP and other organizations were addressing it and so forth. So being a kid, you weren't sophisticated enough to know all that was going on in society that adults were dealing with in those early years, you know. And I remember certain things. I remember when the war ended, and I heard bells ringing and people shouting and sirens going off. And I can remember how confused I was and how I asked my dad, "What's wrong? What's going on?" And he said, "The war has just ended." And you could hear, even from the downtown sections, almost seems like from the other side of Chattanooga, people shouting and all of this going on with the church bells ringing and so forth. And that day stands out in my memory to a large extent as to what was going on there. But as we go through the 40s and after the war, there's another tension that develops. And that's with the GIs coming in and the GI Bill and things offered to them that was not always offered to the black community to the same degree. You know, they were building a lot of houses outside the core part of the city. People were being able to move out into those areas, and so you had that kind of going on. And it set up even more barriers to some extent. because blacks couldn't buy those homes in certain areas that were being built and developed. And not as many homes were being built in the core part of the black community.
Right.
Other than they were addressing the disease and epidemics by closing down some of the places that were breeding some of these things. And so that was a concern. And they started to build more federal homes, federal projects, and that kind of thing. But anyway, we had two churches, black churches in my community that were the predominant churches. We did have a holiness church, but the Baptist church and the Methodist church were the dominant churches. But from then on, we were more in the Methodist during the day. I tell people I was a Methodist during the day, and at night I was Baptist. So that's kind of my background.
Gotcha. Okay. So how did that affect you as the years moved forward and into the 60s? Let's go forward to the 60s. Civil rights movements are going on. Dr. Martin Luther King steps into the spotlight at some point, and I mean, the protests are starting to take place. All of these things are happening around, especially in the South. How did that growing up prepare you for all that?
Normally we think in terms of Dr. King being the first person who starts the civil rights movement. He did not start the civil rights movement.
Correct. Yes.
And the civil rights movement had started during the 50s, and one of the biggest impacts on the civil rights movement was the 1954 Supreme Court decision
Sure.
outlawing segregation in the schools. And then in 1957, we had one of the biggest civil rights conflicts in Clinton, Tennessee, which is just above Knoxville, was one of the first integration that was dominant in the news in 57. But I had quit high school in 1955,
Okay.
and I went into the military. And in the military, I experienced a different life, of course. I was sent to Mississippi out of basic training from Lackland, and I don't have to tell you that was a new experience in Mississippi. 1955, when Emmett Till was killed, I was in Mississippi.
Oh,
I woke up, I wanted to say it was either Saturday or Sunday. Seems like it was a weekend, and I didn't have to rush to get to work. And so listening to the radio and heard the news, a Negro boy was killed in Philadelphia, Monty, Mississippi, I guess it was at that time. And some of the details, negative kind of details that were spelled out about Emmett being there and the white lady who undoubtedly he said some words to or whistled or did something. But anyway, that climate was there to some extent. I had just arrived in Mississippi in 55 when Emmett was killed. So that was kind of on our plate as something to talk about. Plus, the military had just integrated. Even though it's integrated, it's segregated. There are no blacks in white rooms or rooming together. And some floors were almost entire white, and some floors were almost entirely black.
well, I know that there's, as you mentioned, you got the 50s and then the 60s and on through. What I want to do is kind of, because of our time limitations, bring us on up to today. And racism, it's nothing new. And the experiences we're seeing over just the last month are nothing new.
Mm-hmm.
But each time it happens, it brings a spotlight on it. And, we see people rise up and raise voices, and then it kind of fades away. And then something else happens, and it rises back up. This time it seems to be a little different, at least in my eyes. I think protests have been going every day since George Floyd was killed. And it just keeps happening. It keeps, the protests are still going. What do you see similar about what's going on today and what you've experienced in the past? And what do you see that's different about this time?
Well, as I mentioned to you, in 1938, what was going on with the epidemics and so forth, very similar to what's going on now. The racial climate was probably similar, but not as overt because there weren't as many protests. lynchings and those things, there could have been gobs of protests because there were reports going on through the 40s and through the latter part of the 30s of some of that kind of thing that was going on to a large extent in various places. We didn't have television, so you didn't have daily reports and that kind of thing. You had radio, and there were people who were addressing it on a higher level. Remember 1955, of course, is a time when the bus boycott was going on in Montgomery. When I said that I'm in the military, out in civilian life, that's going on. And so we're more or less reading about it and hearing about it on the news. The television was there during that time, of course, during 55. And I can remember the first television I'd ever seen during the 50s, of course, that leading up to this, but television started to become a little bit more a part of the society when the Montgomery thing is going on. So we hear about it, and we can turn the television on and see the news, not to the extent that you can now. So it wasn't as prevalent, and it wasn't as impactful, even what was going on in Montgomery and what was going on in other places. You had civil rights bus I guess the bus boycott was going on there, but sit-ins and those things were just getting ready to get started. And so some of the civil rights groups were challenging even this mainline civil rights groups, NAACP, and some that had been around for years, more conservative. They were getting to be a little bit more forceful in their approach to civil rights. And by the way, civil rights has been going on as long as blacks have been here to some extent. And it took on, after Reconstruction, a different flavor. It took on a different flavor during the 40s, and after people got out of the war and the war's over, it took on a different flavor leading up to the 50s. And when you get into the 60s, it's a different flavor. King and his group, are more or less, he's more articulate, and he's more a voice that people are being able to listen to. But some of the young people are even challenging him and his approach as they are challenging the NAACP as being the conservative group. They were more into the legal aspects of challenging the society constitutionally, NAACP. Others were more involved in street protest and bus boycotts and sit-ins. And those things took off during the 60s. And so had a child born in 1960, first time I'd ever voted in 1960. 1963, president is killed, Kennedy. I'm riding to work down Chattanooga to go work in the afternoon when I hear that he's killed. This is impacting. And when I leave the factory in 1968, King is killed, April the 4th, and that's about the time, I think I left a little bit ahead of that to leave that. Took a job with Big Brothers Association, and I entered the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. I'd gone through a junior college prior to that. I graduated in 1968. I have a child born in 1968. I enrolled at University of Chattanooga because they were just getting ready to transition. And I'm among some of the first black students at University of Tennessee at Chattanooga in 1968.
So you had some things going on.
I had a lot of going on in that time. So I'm listening to what's going on outside, but what's going on in my life as well. First time in 1968, Methodist Church is merging. And so the last meeting that we have is a black conference in the black districts. It was Tennessee, Kentucky conference were black. And so we had a meeting, the last gathering. Where do you think it was scheduled?
Chattanooga?
No, Memphis.
Memphis,
1968. King has just been killed. April.
Oh.
We meet over there in May in one of the hotels, first integrated hotel downtown Memphis. I walked from the Memphis hotel down to see the Lorraine Motel where he has just been killed. And so I walked down there. It's just not even a month since he's been killed. It's still taped off the balcony and the places where he has been killed. when I walked down in 1968 to see where he has been killed. And so this is fresh. Not only are we addressing the fact that we're ready now to integrate a Methodist church, and we've got to decide on how we're going to strategize to be a part of this church.
Yeah.
And at the same time say goodbye to all of the friends through Kentucky and Tennessee that are going to be realigned into this new church, really.
Right.
And so we're meeting, and so we're trying to address that. And then, of course, the cloud is hanging over because Dr. King has just been killed. And so when I get home, in fact, I was in Nashville the day he was killed with a meeting that we had here too in Nashville, and didn't know about it until I got home because we didn't have the radio on. We were just talking and so forth.
Yeah.
And I didn't know about it until I drove up my driveway, and my wife met me with tears in her eyes at the door to tell me that he had just been killed. And so my family and I went to Atlanta for the viewing, really, of just the casket, which was placed at the Capitol in Atlanta. And we drove down, and we're part of that crowd to go in and view his casket at the Capitol building there in Atlanta.
That's incredible
Yeah,
space of time right there.
Yeah.
Can you help us maybe talk about staying with the more current theme where we're living in right now? I know people struggle with racism. There's this idea that racism is a thing of the past, that it doesn't really exist today. Have you had any personal experiences with racism, or can you help us understand why it's still going on just in the last few years?
Well, there's some subtleties that still, are prevalent, because there are enough of us still around who probably have lived in those eras and still have it hanging on us. So it's hard for a lot of us to adjust to the changes, and anytime race develops, some of the sensitivities are prevalent. Like I told you, I went to work as a pharmaceutical representative. When I moved to Nashville, that was primarily my job. And I had to travel. I had about 25 counties as my responsibility, all the way from Crossville, Tennessee to Hohenwald, Tennessee, and from half of Nashville down to the Alabama line. Initially was my assignment. And I had a few experiences. One I had in a little town up near Crossville, and I won't name the town in case some of the people might be watching. But I had gone into this little clinic with a doctor who was very welcoming, warm doctor, and very professional. And we had a presentation, and I came out of his office, and my car was out front, out in the parking lot, if you can call it a parking lot. It was kind of a rural setting, And these characters were sitting over under a tree when I came out, and they looked questionable, but I took my time and kind of showed that I wasn't intimidated, and took my time, opened my trunk and taking off my coat. And I saw this sign on my bumper. I didn't have time to read it, but I just put my bag in the trunk, and then I drove off up the highway, I guess 4 or 5 miles. And I got out, and the tape message was, "Mr. Coon, don't be here when the sun goes down."
Really?
Yeah. And I had to laugh and say, what in the world would I be doing?
Don't be here when the sun goes.
Yeah, don't be here. What would I be doing here when the sun goes down?
Oh.
And but it was serious but amusing at the same time. And of course, these characters, if I'd had a chance to talk with them, that's about what I would have said to them. But I drove on up the highway, and I was going to Jamestown, Tennessee. And that's one of the trips that I was making up there. And I had another experience in another town that was similar, a little negative here and there. And some subtle things, but more than my experiences to those couple of negative experiences, I had very positive experiences. I had very welcoming people. In places where I was surprised.
Yeah.
But, so I had some negative experiences and I had some positive experiences. Many times when people respond on large scales, there's a certain mentality that's a group mind as well as an individual mind. Mm-hmm. And it depends on where the wind is blowing with the group, is how the group responds and how the group will do certain things, both negative and positive with a group mind. And that's not just secular, that's biblical. Mm-hmm. If you go from Genesis to Revelation, there are conflicts. Some of it's racial, some of it's ethnic. Mm-hmm. Many times it's groups against another group. They didn't put all of Israel in slavery because they were afraid of an individual.
Right.
They were afraid of a group. Mm-hmm. And it's a group that puts them in slavery. And it takes the group to keep them in slavery for 400 years. And it takes heaven's protest, march, if you would, all right, to get them out of slavery. Heaven had to protest with 10 plagues, and they still didn't want to let them out, right, even though they're dying of an epidemic. Heaven's epidemic is sent to them, and they're not wanting to release them. And then finally, in the midst of their epidemic, they said, get out of here. All right, and then they leave. Now, that's not the only protest that the Bible brings to bear, as you know. All right. There are many of them, and we can go to the Babylonian, but you don't have to get that far. Yeah. And, Amos cries out against Israel for doing the same thing, for being prejudiced, for being racist. It's a human kind of thing. Yes. You know, the three personas that the Bible presents for us, God, the devil, or Satan, and humankind. And they've been in conflict with one another ever since. And so that goes on constantly. Mm-hmm. And when Jesus comes on the scene, heaven has another demonstration. Mm-hmm. All right? Jesus comes walking in on Palm Sunday, and he disturbs the society. He disturbs, yes. All right? And so in the midst of his demonstration, he doesn't know it, but he's going to be assassinated. Mm-hmm. And he's assassinated. And these people are caught off guard, even his followers. So what happens to King or what happens to those people, it's biblical. And how we respond to it has to be biblical. And Jesus says to his disciples, before this happens, he tells them what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And he says, unless you abide in me and I abide in you, and my love abides in you, you can't bring forth good fruit. And so it's happened in the church. It happens in Methodism. We've had the same crisis as the secular world. Right. You know, and so it's nothing different. And so when Jesus rises from the dead, it's a demonstration too, to some extent. But it's for the church. And it's for the church to abide in his love. He said, this commandment I give you, that you love one another. Right. Someone said to me that regardless of how many laws that society passes, they can't make you love one another. No, right. It's not for the church. Jesus commanded us to love one another.
Yeah, we said in the intro, it doesn't matter. You can't pass a law to fix racism because it's a matter of the heart. You know, people's hearts have to change in order.
You can pass a law for certain actions.
Yes.
You can't pass a law to make people love. Right. After a while, if people don't practice certain hates, the certain hates don't prevail. You have to practice it. Hmm. And one of the things that kept segregation going was the fact of fear in whites being called lovers of black people. Yes. That was the worst thing that they could hear. When John says perfect love casts out fear, he could have said perfect fear casts out love, right? Yeah. And if you're living in fear of allowing the love of God to prevail in our hearts, and our relationship with life has to be different from the secular world. We are a church of Jesus Christ. And if John says to Nicodemus, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that's a preface to what Jesus says later. That's not the end of it. He's saying that he loved so much, and he didn't come into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. All right. And then John goes over and writes his letter, and he really becomes pointed. How can you say you love God whom you have not seen and hate your brother whom you walk with daily? So that's my answer. If we as a church live out the mandates of the gospel, then we live on a different plane. And we demonstrate to the world. He says, you're the salt of the earth. He says, you're the light of the world. Now, if we're salt and if we're the light, he says, let your light so shine before men that they would see your good works and glorify the Father who is in heaven. So if we're doing that, we're speaking louder than any demonstration because the church is living out the faith that they say they proclaim.
Well, there's another thing I want to talk to you about. There's obviously a lot of pushback also going on with the whole Black Lives Matter movement. Many people say, well, Christ died for everybody. It's all lives matter. Why are we only focusing on Black Lives Matter? It's everybody. Is there a way you could maybe help some of our people understand why we say Black Lives Matter, why that's important to say and distinguish from all lives matter? Obviously, all lives are important to God.
Sure,
I mean, Jesus did die for them.
Sure.
But why is it important to focus on the Black lives?
Well, constitutionally, the United States has said that Black lives didn't matter. The Dred Scott case that happened in Missouri, and the final say by the Supreme Court was that whites and that blacks had no rights that whites had to recognize, to honor. Barbara Jordan said something from Houston, Texas, while she was in Congress, that we have not really been included in the we the people of the United States. And it is high time that we be a part of the constitutional message that says we the people of the United States in order to establish a more perfect union, and then outline the constitutional things that were there. If those lives constitutionally mattered, then the blacks have always said, we are a part of it. Certain laws and certain things didn't pass because they did not want to say that blacks were full citizens of the United States. That's always been a question mark for people in the United States. They've always said white lives matter constitutionally. Blacks have said we are a part of it. Now, what was happening with the Missouri Compromise and with Dred Scott in Missouri was when the Supreme Court says he had no rights that whites had to recognize or honor. They had certain states that were free states, certain states that were slave states. The compromise was that they would add a slave state, but they also had to
Free state.
have a free state. And the free state, now they were concerned about the vote. And they said, these blacks who are there, how are you going to count them as part of the population? They wanted to count them as a part of the population in order to have enough to rule in Congress. But they decided on what? They were just 3/5 of a person. And they added Maine. So when we're saying Black Lives Matter, we're saying it out of all that has happened to blacks. Lynchings, all of those things that ignored his rights in courts. The things that happened to him in the court system leading up to this. Not just what's happening lately with the blacks who are killed by the police. They've been saying that all along. Constitutionally, these lives matter. if they are part of the United States, and if justice is done, then they should receive justice. If it's going to be in the court system, they have to receive justice. Now, the police are just to arrest. They're not the judge and the executioners. That's not their job. Of course, if they're threatened, they should defend themselves. But someone has said in an investigation, whether it's true or not, that many of the racist groups had pledged that they would become a part of certain parts of the mainstream of American system in order to carry out some of the things that they had pledged to do within the society. And race was one of those things. The Klan groups, the neo-Nazis, and those groups going to become part of the police. And in some ways, they were always there. The old sheriffs in rural places, old judges, even when I grew up in Chattanooga, there were judges who people knew were part of certain racist groups. They didn't have to hide. You know, they more or less came out and said they were within their campaigns and within other things that they would say.
I mean, I'll be sure to represent our white values.
Even more overt than that.
Yeah.
Even more overt than that.
Sure.
In some of this, we had a judge in Chattanooga that even when he was tried, his name was Schofield, and he was tried for a lot of activity. Finally, got off the bench. But one of the more overt persons along those lines. But there were some, and there were some even in the police department who were sheriffs and police heads of the police department and so forth, who were rather overt within their attitudes and what they would do and what they would say. And so when young people are saying it now, and some who are more versed on the history, they're not just saying it out of the context. Some are just following the crowd. You always have that, who are just parroting what someone else says. But some are pretty learned. And some of our young people know the history of where they have been and what they have come through. And so when they're saying it, it's singing in the context when they were denied and their lives did not matter. That it's high time that we recognize that these lives matter just as much. Now, all lives do matter, especially for us in the church. From a biblical standpoint, we ought to be the first to say that. But God has said that all lives matter. And we believe that all lives matter. But when we have neglected to include all lives and to say that they matter, then someone has to cry out.
Right.
You know, and that's what God would say to the prophets. It's high time that you cry out.
Time to speak up.
And speak up.
Yeah.
And say that to places of power. And so when Amos and those prophets are crying out, they're doing what God told them to do.
Right.
You know.
And I've heard it said, and I don't know if you would agree with this analogy or not, but this is not my illustration. This is something that just helped me understand it maybe a little bit more, and you've helped me go back even further. But the metaphor of whose house is on fire right now, it's Black Lives Matter. What they're saying is, yeah, they're not saying all lives don't matter, but what they're saying is, but our house is on fire at this moment. We need help to end this tragic crime that's happening against us.
Yeah, but I'd like to put it in the context of history. They've always said that.
Yeah.
They've always been crying out that the Black Lives Matter.
As we come towards end of our time together today, I guess want to give you an opportunity to talk about what do you see needing to happen in society? I mean, we hear a lot of different people saying this. We already said you can't pass laws to change hearts, but you can pass laws that make things possible and should be changed. God's justice is about setting things right in the world that are wrong. Our hearts need to change along with that. How does that happen? I mean, how do we change not only our hearts, but how do I make sure my daughters are not raised, are raised to think differently, to recognize that.
Well, hate and negatives have to be taught as much as love does. If they're not taught hate, and if they're taught love, are taught respect, it doesn't have to be biblical love for the masses of society to take on just respecting other people.
Yeah.
Young people are living in a little different world, and in some ways it's a world that Jim Crow was afraid of, that people would live together and that people would respect one another.
Are you more hopeful right now about the future of racial relations, or?
Well, I've always been hopeful, and there have been times when we have gone through these ups and downs, and times where we think there's an over crisis. In fact, maybe in some ways it's very serious right now, but in some ways it's more mild than it has been in the past. When King was killed, as you know, we had demonstrations all over the country, and they were, some instances, more violent demonstrations because of the emotions centered around him and the love that people had for him, and feeling that he was not just killed by James Earl Ray, but killed by society, you know, and the attitudes there. But you know, we moved through that, and we'll move through this. And there'll be some other times when we'll have some difficulty. Within the black community itself, you know, we've had times when we had to adjust because we took on some of the same kinds of teachings and environment that they had been exposed to. So we had groups that were divided against each other, and we had certain things that were admirable depending on what the society had said that blacks took on against one another, and they had to adjust. But it wasn't just us, whites had to too. Mm-hmm. Remember, half of the people who came here were indentured servants.
That's right. That's right. Thank you for joining us here today, and I hope it helps.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and I pray that it does, and I pray that that the church especially becomes the instrument by which we can speak to the rest of society, and we can speak to one another, and that we won't come with more of a, as St. Paul said to the Corinthian church, more of a fleshly thinking, yes, but a spiritual thinking group. And if we do, then I think we'll be able to move forward with the kind of peace and love that Jesus talks about.
Absolutely. Would it be too much for me to ask you to say a prayer for us as we close?
Oh, no, I'll be happy to. Gracious God, we give you thanks for your love and for your spirit that embraces us. And we thank you, Lord, for your commandments to us, that we would be able to move through any crisis if we would abide in you and you abide in us. And we can become the oneness that you talks about in your epistle or your prayer to your God, to your Father. And we would take that on, Lord, to be the people that you want us to be. Bless Chris and bless him as the leader of this congregation. And bless Hermitage United Methodist Church to be instruments of your peace. And your love would abide in us as we abide in you. And that we would move forward. Bless those who are hurting right now from sickness, from the epidemics that are around us, both physical and spiritual. In your precious name we pray.
I don't wanna be afraid every time I face the waves. I don't wanna be afraid. I don't wanna be afraid. I don't wanna fear the storm just because I hear the roar. I don't wanna fear the storm. No, I don't wanna fear the storm. Peace be still, say the word and I will set my feet upon the till I'm dancing in the deep. Peace, be still, you are here, so it is well. Even when my eyes can't see, I will trust the voice that speaks. I'm not gonna be afraid, 'cause these waves are only waves. I'm not gonna be afraid, no, I'm not gonna be afraid. I'm not gonna fear the storm, you are greater than its roar. Oh, I'm not gonna fear the storm, no, I'm not gonna fear it all. Oh, peace, be still, say the word and I will set my feet upon the sea till I'm dancing in the deep. Oh, peace, be still, you are here, so it is well. Even when my eyes can't see, I will trust the voice that speaks. Let faith rise up, oh heart, believe. Let faith rise up in me. Let faith rise up, oh heart, believe. Let faith rise up in me. Let faith rise up, oh heart, believe. Let faith rise up in me. Oh, let faith rise up, oh heart, believe. Let faith rise up in me. Oh, peace, be still, say the word and I will set my feet upon the sea till I'm dancing in the deep. Oh, peace, be still, you are here, so it is well. Even when my eyes can't see, I will trust the voice that speaks. Oh, peace, be still, say the word and I will set my feet upon the sea till I'm dancing in the deep. Oh, peace, be still, you are here, so it is well. Even when my eyes can't see, I will trust the voice that speaks.
So this week, I hope that you allow God and God's Holy Spirit to work within you as you traverse through the turbulent waters of racism in our world. And so may God grant His peace and His love and His grace to pour over you so that you can give that to others that you come in contact with, everyone, in the same way, all in the name of Jesus. Have a great week.